Ladies and gentlemen, may I now invite Honorable Minister Shri Arun Jaitley, and I request him to kindly make his inaugural address.
I had the privilege of being invited by the foundation a little more than a year ago, at a time when the campaign for the last general election was on. The Prime Minister, then as our shadow prime ministerial candidate, had been the chief guest at the conference. And at that time when the conference was being held, obviously there was a mood of larger gloom in the country. And the broad perception was that India had gone indefinitely through a phase of policy paralysis. And I was recollecting from my notes as to what had gone wrong at that time was amongst the analysis that I had an opportunity to present before the audience. And I distinctly remember there was a few point analysis which had been made. And one of the analysis made was that the political model of governance in India had got skewed up because the prime ministerial office itself, which should be the ultimate, the last decision-making body in the country and must have the final say, had been marginalized. And decision-making had transformed itself into outside the government. The obvious impact of this was on policy making. And the drift in policy making was that the last 1 decade had gone back to those wasted decades of the 1970s and the 80s. I call them the wasted decades because the emphasis during that period, when a large part of the world which was competing with India, China for instance, several other major Asian economies, had decided to liberalize, we had decided to impose tighter controls. And therefore our emphasis during the 1970s had shifted from increased productivity and increased wealth generation into redistribution of existing resources. Now that obsolete model which the world had rejected in the 70s, but we continued to stick to it partly, wholly during the 70s and partly even during the 80s. Because of the shift of the power center outside the prime ministerial office, through those power centers was reintroduced in the last decade. And that is eventually what had resulted, amongst other factors, in slowing up the growth process. Decision making was vitiated for various reasons, including corruption. And therefore, there was a huge policy diversion which took place. And policy diversion was that instead of debating how to grow faster, we were still bogged in a debate how natural resources should be distributed. Whether the governments must always have discretions, and those discretions must be exercised for colorable reasons. And investors who benefited from those dubious decisions had suffered. And eventually the system came back hard on them. People forfeited their investments. And India lost its sheen as an investment destination. Our taxation policy had offended many. And our inability to build up a larger consensus, amongst others, further paralyze decision making. It's in the backdrop of that India had to move on. And while moving on, I think it's a tribute to the wisdom of the electorate since the last conclave of India Foundation was held, that the electorate decided to give a decisive mandate. After 30 years, India got a single party majority government, though we are still a coalition government and will probably continue to be one. But the internal pressures of government on decision making don't exist. The Prime Minister unquestionably has the last word, and no government, no finance minister can ever implement a series of changes and reforms, or any other minister for that matter, till has the full backing of the Prime Minister. And what is extremely important is the direction, even in otherwise adverse global situations, that the Indian economy has to take. And it doesn't require a great analysis or even greater academic wisdom to decide as to what direction we are to take. Facts are crystal clear. You have India's agricultural sector, very largely dependent on rain. Our rain-fed area is huge and therefore always continues to be fragile. Its fragility is added by the fact that for 15% of our income, 55% of our population depends on it. And therefore, there is a need to restructure the Indian model, the structural model, where lesser number of people have to be employed in that agriculture and more will have to be diverted into other sectors of the economy. And in order to divert more people into other sectors of the economy, you will need a fast-growing services sector. Our services sector is reasonably fast-growing. You will need more urban centers, more suburban centers, which eventually do act as important engines of growth. And you will need a very vibrant manufacturing sector. And therefore, over the next few decades, you will have a large influx of population otherwise employed in agriculture coming into these sectors. And these sectors really must have the capacity to absorb. It's here that we must also be clear that large industry has a capacity, but somewhat a limited capacity to absorb them. It's facing its own challenges. And therefore, you'll have to encourage, for the purposes of generating employment, for the purposes of getting this workforce into these segments, a large number of small entrepreneurs all over the country. Jayant was just now mentioning the banking reforms package that we have implemented. And one of the reasons why we had to implement, besides internal issues of the government, where we needed to professionalize the management of the banks, where we needed to have the top managers who are completely selected for professional considerations and not otherwise, where you need to recapitalize the bank to feed some economic strength into them. Their NPAs are also on account of several factors, part of which are also attributable to external factors. The steel NPAs are due to external factors. We are trying to rectify them. The infrastructure and the highway NPAs are substantially due to our internal factors, and therefore we are realizing the limitations of the private sector when there was a slow-growing economy. And therefore the public investment has picked up much larger, as Jayant was just now mentioning. And we are still grappling with how to deal with the power sector once. But most of these are with the large industry. And therefore, their ability to kickstart Indian economy at this stage is tied up by several limitations. Of course, in the spheres they are doing well, they have an important role to play. And therefore, it's a large amount of public investment. It's encouraging foreign direct investment. And it's also diverting a large part of our banking resources into the unorganized sector, into the small and medium enterprises who have a huge capacity at employment generation. And therefore, for any architecture of Indian growth, along with a large public investment, the private investment, as and when it picks up, foreign direct investment, we'll also need a lot of resource diversion to skill India and to make these people in the unorganized sector, the small and the medium enterprises, also to start generating jobs. Kickstarting our manufacturing sector and its growth rate improving further, I think is one of the greatest challenges to the Indian economy today. If we can handle that problem, its ability to absorb a number of people coming from rural India and adding to India's growth story is going to be much larger. Fortunately, the service sector in India has been doing well. It's always in the vicinity of a double-digit growth. And the growth in the other sectors is going to directly impact on it. It's for this reason that we've now decided our areas of the growth of architecture to concentrate first instance even on agriculture. So the soil health card, our emphasis on rural infrastructure, the 50,000 crores to be spent on the irrigation schemes. And some of the states have done exceedingly well. I must compliment the state of Andhra Pradesh yesterday, which in creating the river grid yesterday, in a period of 165 days since the new government took over, can actually change the face of a number of those drought-affected areas which have been conventional in the state of Andhra Pradesh. Madhya Pradesh has done it with great ease and capacity, and that's reflected in almost a 20% growth in agriculture as far as Madhya Pradesh is concerned on an average in the last few years. And that 20% growth in agriculture is now impacting on other sectors because the purchasing power is going up, the rural infrastructure is improving, the roads are doing better, important cities are coming up in the state, and that's an impact which you can see. So 3 days ago when the World Bank gave the state ratings, it's the new age states. Gujarat was always expected to do well. But what was most remarkable was that the tribal dominated states of Chhattisgarh, Odisha and Jharkhand had moved amongst the first 6. Which actually indicates that these states which have a large number of poor people, a very large number of tribals, but have a rich mineral resource, are now easing their processes and concentrating on value addition so that jobs can be created within those states, so infrastructure can be better, power projects can be much better. And therefore, that seems to be a silver lining. Therefore, it's agriculture and the increased investment in rural agriculture and irrigation, rural infrastructure and irrigation, which is one part of the priorities as far as the government is concerned. To impact on infrastructure, which will have a direct link to the manufacturing sector, this year a very large number of, a large amount of resource, and we've used the reduction in the oil prices globally, and that has actually had a great emphasis in the budgetary shift. So the percentage of subsidies as a part of the GDP itself has declined. And that rationalization has enabled us to shift a large part of our resource into infrastructure. So the road sector is building up, the railways are looking up with a lot more money in their pocket, the rural roads are going to do better. We need to move a little faster as far as seaports are concerned, and even look at the existing structure of the management through the trust system which is currently on. And these are areas which we really have to look at. In order to add to that manufacturing sector, we've been conscious of the fact that there is a need to attract investment. So when there are pressures on domestic investment, you look at public investment, you look at foreign direct investment, which has increased substantially in the last 1 year. Because without investment, there's going to be no economic activity or no additional economic activity. Because investment is always, from whichever source it comes, an important additionality of resource. After doing that, I think there are two things which are still work in progress. The first work in progress is the easing of doing businesses. I'm glad the state rankings have now come up so that states start competing with each other. Today, you don't have any section of the economy which is saying, or the industry which is saying that I'm being harassed and I'm not being given permissions. Those procedures have been substantially rationalized. But then the entire regulatory system and other systems have to prepare themselves much faster for this change. Our taxation systems are pending disputes. Now, a number of them have been put to rest, and we are trying over the next few days itself so that many others can be put to sleep, either by a judicial resolution or by an executive resolution. Natural resources, we've rationalized the system of allocations, we've done away with the controversies. There are many other reforms which we have in the pipeline. The GST reform is stuck because of political reasons. The bankruptcy code, the dispute resolution in major contracts, expeditious arbitration procedures, a public procurement laws, and these are all which we've been trying to put on track. In a situation where there is turmoil almost by the day as far as global markets are concerned, we are trying to make the fundamentals of our own economy a little sound so that our own ability to resist these changes can substantially improve. And once we are able to walk on this growth track, I'm quite certain the architecture for growth for India would be settled, strong and deep. Thank you very much.
May I now request Mr. Jayant Sinha, Honourable Minister, to kindly make his welcome address.
Now, the convention today is titled The Architecture for Growth. And I think that is a very appropriate title because of what we are embarked on right now. I'm reminded of last year when we had the first India Economic Convention, when we were very fortunate to have the Honorable Finance Minister, then he was the leader of the opposition in the Rajya Sabha, and the Honorable Prime Minister, then he was, of course, the BJP's candidate for Prime Minister, address the gathering at that point. And they laid out, I think, a vision for India and for India's economic growth that we have consistently followed through on. And we've consistently followed through in the party manifesto that was released for the Lok Sabha elections in March, April, May of last year. In the budget of July 2014, which the Honorable Finance Minister presented, in all of the public discussions that we had thereafter, and then, of course, in the budget that we presented in February of this year. And if I were to describe that architecture, that economic architecture, or the approach that we have taken as far as economic policy making is concerned, I would try and group it into three big categories. The first is, what is the overall objective? What type of economic growth are we trying to pursue? Number two, what are the economic principles that we are following? And number three, what are some of the signature big ticket reform initiatives that are underway, some of which have already taken, I think, very good shape and are moving forward very successfully, and then two or three others that are in the process of really taking shape and being implemented. So those are the three areas I'll touch on. But let me first start with, what is the overall objective? How are we thinking about economic growth in India? And how is that different from what has happened in the past? I think we can characterize our economic philosophy as one of building India's productive capacity. We want to build India's productive capacity so that we can sustain 8 to 10% non-inflationary GDP growth rate, not just for a few years, which is what has been India's destiny in the last few decades, but to be able to achieve that 8 to 10% growth steadily through boom and bust cycles. And in fact, if you look at China, that is what China has been able to achieve over 3 decades, growth of over 9% across 3 decades, which has really enabled them to be able to deliver a much better life for their citizens. So we need to be able to build India's productive capacity so we can sustain those high growth rates. And to be able to do that, we have to build up India's hard assets and soft assets. The hard assets are, of course, our infrastructure, our roads, our bridges, our ports, our power plants, our factories, all of the hard assets that are necessary to build up our infrastructure. But it's also about our soft assets, the employability and the skills of our people, our institutions, and our innovation ecosystem. We have to build up our soft assets as well. And this approach that we have of building up India's productive capacity so that we don't have the supply side bottlenecks that have stymied our growth in the past, this approach I would characterize as being an approach that is much more supply side oriented, much more investment driven than the approach of the previous government. The approach of the previous government, I would characterize at least, as being much more demand side oriented and much more consumption driven. So we have a very different economic philosophy when we think about economic growth for India. Now, as we think of building India's productive capacity, the hard assets and the soft assets, what are the economic principles that we are following? As the Honorable Prime Minister has said, and the Honorable Finance Minister have said many times, we are a government that believes in Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. We are a pro-poor government. And no government in India can be anything else, because we are still a very poor country. We have hundreds of millions of people living in extreme poverty. And so our first and most important purpose has to be able to help the poor. So we are a pro-poor government. And most of our policies are intended to be able to provide a better quality of life to our poor people. Ladies and gentlemen, because we are a pro-poor government, we are also a pro-market government. Because we are a pro-poor government, we are also a pro-market government. And in fact, there is no other way to serve the poor than to ensure that our economy grows and prospers and flourishes and adds jobs. So we are both a pro-poor government and a pro-market government. And the Honorable Finance Minister has said many times that it is a false trade-off to say that if you're a pro-poor government, you're not a pro-market, pro-business government. So those are two of our very important principles, pro-poor and pro-market, pro-poor, in terms of the policy making that we do. The third principle that I think is very important for us is to say that we are a government that believes in empowerment, not entitlement. We believe in empowerment, not entitlement. And if you look at some of our important initiatives, whether it is Jan Dhan, whether it's irrigation and so on, you'll see that our goal is to be able to provide our people with the resources, the opportunities, the tools, so that they can make a better life for themselves. Because we think that's the way, that is the way in which we can provide them dignity and a way of generating a better life for themselves. We have to provide them those tools and opportunities. So we are a government that focuses on empowerment, not entitlement. The fourth very important principle that we follow is one of minimum government, maximum governance. Minimum government, maximum governance. And the idea of maximum governance is to be able to put in place a rules-driven, policy-based state with minimum discretion. And for all of you as business people, the fact that we want to have a rules-driven state bound by law and order, where there is as little discretion as possible, will be, I think, very reassuring. Because we want corruption, we want discretion to be taken out of the system so that you have a fair, simple, and predictable policy regime, taxation regime, that tells you with a high degree of certainty what to expect. So that is our fourth very important principle that we follow. And then the fifth principle that we put into practice also is around cooperative federalism. Cooperative federalism. We think that India's 29 states are responsible partners in progress with the central government. And it is our job to be able to provide them with the resources, the best practices, the support, the policies that will enable them to flourish. Because as the Honorable Prime Minister said, unless we make these states the pillars of our progress, we cannot move forward. So cooperative federalism, which also can become competitive federalism as the states try to do better and attract investment, is a very foundational principle for us. Now, with that as the overall objective, to build up India's productive capacity, and these as our important economic principles, we have launched a series of signature reforms or missions. When Mr. Mittal spoke, he mentioned some of them. I'll just highlight a few, and I can tell you these are the ones that are already making a real difference on the ground. And then there are 2 or 3 others that we are working on right now. So I'll list those, and then I'll end my statements because the Honorable Finance Minister is here, and I'm sure you all want to hear from him as well. But the 4 or 5 things that we have already launched that are making a real difference on the ground, number one is Jan Dhan, which is going to be translated into a platform for universal social security, which the Honorable Finance Minister had spoken about in his budget. So that's a very, very important initiative of ours that we think is truly going to be transformational because we are going to put in place universal social security in India. Number 2, we are very focused on jobs. And what we're doing in Make in India and Skill India is really to be able to provide jobs for our young people. Number 3, we are focused on agriculture. And in agriculture, what we're doing in irrigation, the soil health card, coming up with a more efficient fertilizer subsidy scheme. In agriculture, we are taking great steps forward. And then the final thing that I will say is what we are doing in terms of public investment in roads, in railways, in ports, and so on. We have ramped up public investment in this budget. Already, if you look at the numbers, you'll see that public investment this year is running 39-40% higher than last year. So this is already a reform measure, an initiative that is making a big difference on the ground. And then finally, what I think we have achieved in the last year or 18 months in terms of macro stabilization, the turnaround in the macro economy, I think is a great achievement for what we've been doing. Now we have many other important initiatives that are still in process. These include GST, which you know all about. These include what we're doing as with respect to banking reforms, NPAs, and so on. So we've got, I think, a whole host of big ticket reform measures that are going to have a tremendous impact on India's economy, on India's future. And those are the ones that we are embarked on right now. I welcome ideas and suggestions from all of you. You have great experiences from what you have seen around the world and what you think can benefit India. And so in the panel discussion that we will have later on, I'd love to be able to engage with all of you and understand from you what we could do better. But once again, thank you very much for being here this morning. It's great to have you all here, and we very much look forward to having the Honorable Finance Minister tell us about his thoughts with respect to the architecture for growth. Thank you very, very much.